Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly compliance seminar. Thanks for joining us again. For those of us who are new, we hold these once a month, usually on the second Thursday of the month. And I welcome any ideas that you have for topics because we want this to be relevant to you and your company. So I'm Ann Lavelle. For those of you who don't know me, for those of you who do, nice to see you again. For those of you who don't know me, I was a partner in a large law firm for a little over 20 years, practicing exclusively management side labor and employment law. I don't practice anymore, but I always enjoyed doing the trainings for employers, and it's just fun to have these discussions. And I hope they are discussions. So if you have any questions or concerns or whatever, just feel free to shoot me a Q&A or a chat, whatever works. I'm not the world's best at technology, but I will take a look at them and try to answer anybody's questions that come in. Okay, we're going to talk about workplace relationships today, not just the romantic ones, even though it is close to Valentine's Day. But before we do that, we always talk about some updates. Stuff that's going on that may be of interest or stuff that's coming up. And the first thing is next month, we will not have a webinar. We're going to host an actual seminar. This is unheard of, given COVID and stuff lately, but we are going to try to do it. And we're going to try to be in person. I'm personally very excited for that because prior to COVID and when I practiced, it's just so much better. You can have such a more interactive experience when you have a seminar. People can ask questions in real time. I'm not fumbling with the keyboard trying to get to the Q&A to see what the question is. And it should be a good experience. Plus, I'm told there will be free food there. So don't come for me, come for the free food. The seminar is going to be on the Fair Labor Standards Act because of all the webinars that we have done over the last 18 months. Far and away, the most questions, the most interest that we've had, the most follow-up has been on the FLSA, exemptions. How do you know who's exempt, non-exempt? How do you handle it? It's a tricky subject. I think that's why there's a lot of interest. So that's what we are going to cover next month, live and in person, instead of the webinar. So please come. I'd love to put faces with the names that I see on the participant list here. Email blast will be going out about this with all the particulars, how you register, the time, etc. It's actually going to be the first part of a two-part seminar. In May, we're hosting a second seminar that's part of the iSolved overall seminar for our clients. And the first part of the FLSA will be talking about exemptions and tricky rules under the FLSA. The second part will actually be looking at court cases and where things went wrong that the employer ended up in court. So I hope you'll join us for both of those. Also coming up in April, so no webinar in March because of the seminar. In April, we're going to talk about the Secure Act because we've gotten a lot of questions about that. And just briefly, that is the legislation that was passed by Congress in early January to try to strengthen this country's retirement system. It discusses things like when people have to take minimum distributions and catch up contributions, items like that. So we'll go over that in detail in April. So if that's something you're interested in, please mark your calendar. Of course, if you have other ideas or questions, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so those are the upcoming things for CTR. From a legal sort of perspective, the things that have sort of come out in the last 30 days that are interesting, at least to me, which some of you may be saying she needs to get a life if she finds these things interesting, but they are important to employers and something you should know about. First, the EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, issued a lengthy document of guidance on the hearing impaired and how those disabilities should be accommodated, in their view, quite readily by employers. One of the reasons they focused on this is they feel that 1 out of 10 individuals has some type of hearing impairment. My kids have selective hearing impairments. That's a different story. No, to be serious, there is a pervasive issue within our society that some people have hearing loss. And the EEOC said, hey, one of the most common solutions from a disability accommodation standpoint for employers is assistive technology. Pardon me. You need to, as an employer, provide that assistive technology to help the person work. And you can say, well, gosh, that's kind of expensive. I'm not sure I can afford that. The EEOC takes a dim view if that's your reason for not providing the assistive technology. And as a side note, that should be your last argument for not providing an accommodation. Because if you say, I can't afford it, whatever the accommodation is for disability, the EEOC will say, okay, what did you spend money on for everything else? How about your holiday party? How much did that cost you? How about the t-shirts in the summer or the Kennywood party? If you're in Pittsburgh, you know Kennywood's the amusement park. So when they issue guidance like this, that means they're focusing on this type of issue for compliance purposes. So something to be aware of. It's a hot button, in other words. They also said, hey, employers who say they can't hire those who are hard of hearing or deaf for safety reasons, they take a dim view of that as well. So you as an employer could say, hey, I can't hire Ann because she doesn't hear well, and she might not hear the forklift beeping and get run over. And the EEOC said, hey, that's stretching it. Really, safety should be the last type of issue that you deny employment for, because there's so many workarounds for the hearing impaired. You can have light systems that flash if something's going on. That should be the rare exception that safety precludes employment for somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing. Okay, moving on. The other thing that was of interest that came out, and it actually came out in our home state here in Pennsylvania over on the east side, was SEPTA, which is the transportation system for Philadelphia. There was a workers' compensation award to an employee's family to an employee who had passed away from COVID. Now, historically, over the last 2 years, we haven't seen many awards for an employee's death because of COVID, because it's so hard to prove where you got the virus from, right? It could be the grocery store, it could be the job, it could be wherever. This workers' comp judge said, hey, there were several co-workers who had COVID right before this individual caught COVID, and the employer didn't have a mask policy in place for this subsection of employees, and they didn't do contact tracing. So shame on you, employer, and I'm going to assume basically that this worker got it from his coworkers because there was known exposure there. It's interesting. It's making the national employment news because it's a unique award. It is persuasive precedent in Pennsylvania, meaning that other courts may look to it and agree with it. They don't have to follow it, but they may look to it and say, yeah, I agree with that reasoning, and I will make a similar award, whether it's workers' compensation or a wrongful death or whatever it might be. So something just to keep in mind there. Also, we had the Federal Trade Commission propose rules or regulations banning almost all non-compete agreements. Right now, this is in what we call the comment stage, that employers and any interested party can reach out to the FTC and tell them what a wonderful idea it is or what a horrible idea it is, or they haven't considered certain things. But that is out there. And non-competes have been taking a beating in the courts to begin with, except in rare circumstances where you have really highly compensated folks or owners or something like that. And several states already ban non-competes in most situations. So now we have a national effort to ban most, not all, but most non-competes that are employment related. So if you rely on non-competes to protect information, it's something you should be aware of. It probably means you need to strengthen your non-disclosure type agreements, your confidential information agreements, because you may not be able to have that non-compete in the near future. Okay, moving along from our updates here. This is the overview of topics that we're going to touch on today. And yes, I'm having a little fun with it in the list here because, a holiday is coming up and you got to smile at some of these situations. one of the things we'll touch on first is coworker friendships. We know without doubt that all studies show that relationships and the tone and culture of your workplace hit your bottom line. If you have a lot of turnover, obviously that's expensive for you. If you get sued, obviously that's expensive for you. So we're going to talk about coworker relationships. This isn't just a Valentine's Day presentation. We'll talk about family relationships in the workplace just briefly, and we will touch on the romantic relationships as well. When we're discussing this, I am assuming that the employment situations we're covering, if you want to apply them to your own workplace, that you do not have a union and that you are not a government employer. The answers to some of these topics are slightly different if either of those two factors are true. So moving on, let's talk about the first one. Now, this case here clearly establishes, and by the way, these were all scenarios that either came from case law, court decisions, or items that I handled when I was practicing. I've changed some of the details to protect the innocent or the guilty, but they're all real life situations. This first example, though, shows that I grew up in the 70s. I'm sorry, I can't talk and swallow at the same time. This one is born out of the Dukes of Hazzard. I had to name it after that. It is a real life situation, but I apparently watched really bad TV back in the 1970s, and this is what this situation reminds me of, is the Dukes of Hazzard. For those of you who are old enough, you'll recognize Bo and Luke Duke were the protagonists in that television series. For those of you who are younger and have no idea what the Dukes of Hazzard is, you're not missing out. Just know that these were two good old Southern boys. In any event, Bo and Luke Duke are the best of friends at work. They share a workstation, they eat lunch together. They're friends outside of work. That's great, right? They each have toolboxes. This doesn't sound like a really healthy workplace relationship right at the moment, because they're friendly with each other, they're good guys at work, all that good stuff. Bo has pictures of his family taped up all over his workstation. In his toolbox are stickers of heavy metal radio stations. That's his thing. Similarly, Luke has pictures of his family. Luke is from the deep South and loves country western music, and the South is in his blood. In addition to various Southern radio station decals, he has a picture of the General Lee from his favorite television show, which would be the Dukes of Hazzard. Again, I'm not recommending that show. The top of the car is prominently displayed. So all of you who grew up in the 70s like myself, what's on the top of that car? It's an orange Dodge Charger with a Confederate flag on the top. The top of the car is prominently displayed, so we see the Confederate flag. He also has a bunch of other car decals. He's into muscle cars. These two guys are tucked away on the shop floor. It's rare that anyone outside of these employees, other employees, goes into the area. Nobody's complaining, right? Bo and Luke seem quite happy with their little corner of the world. It's all good. They're great employees. Bo is African-American, Luke is Caucasian, he's white. Is this a good relationship, and does HR need to step in? So I will say I've tweaked this scenario slightly from what actually happened. In the real life case, it was an actual Confederate flag. But it was true in the actual situation that Luke just loved the South. He, from Alabama type of thing, and he just loved everything about the South. What do we do with this? So the first thing I would say is this is a little bit of a close call. And this in large part depends on your company culture. So the first rule here in all of these situations is to know that as a private non-governmental employer, that's why this is important, there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of expression. That's a right between individuals and the government. It is not a right in the workplace. So to the extent that anybody has an employee who says, I have speech, and pounds their fist a little bit on the desk, or freedom of expression, no, you don't actually in the workplace. The employer is free to set the tone and culture of the workplace as long as it's not discriminatory. So you as an employer could have a rule that says no stickers at all, no decals, no pictures, no nothing. We're just not going down this path. forget it. You could have a rule like that. It's probably not a realistic rule because everybody has pictures, everybody has little whatever floating around their desk or their work area. But where do we draw the line then to say, is this okay? Nobody's complaining. They're good friends. So the second rule, right? The first rule is I, as an employee, don't have any freedom of speech or freedom of expression rights. The second rule is just because nobody's complaining doesn't mean HR turns a blind eye. And the epitome or the prime case that established that concept was a case out of Detroit. And in Detroit, they're a large auto manufacturer, not surprisingly. And apparently some of their employees were quite artistic and liked to play with clay and pottery. And those employees decided to decorate the lunchroom with pottery that they had made that was in the shape of body parts. Nobody complained. Is that right? Now, this case is from 20 some years ago. Nobody complained. HR did nothing about it because nobody was complaining, right? There's no squeaky wheel. Who cares? Unfortunately for them, eventually somebody just filed suit. They didn't complain. They just said, hey, there's a pervasive harassing environment at our workplace because everybody knows this inappropriate pottery is sitting on the lunch tables in the employer provided lunchroom. HR walks through every day, senior management walks through every day. Nobody has pulled it. And the court agreed and said, hey, you don't need complaints to take action when you have something wrong in the workplace. In fact, you employer need to be proactive. So first rule, no freedom of expression or freedom of speech. Second rule, we don't need a complaint to take action. And in fact, if we rely on that we didn't have a complaint, we will get ourselves in trouble. If we know about it and we think it's wrong, we need to take action. So the third question is it wrong? And that's the close call here, right? What does that General Lee car or that Confederate flag represent? And we can say, gosh, it's a close call and they're happy as clams and they're not customer facing employees. Maybe we pull Bo aside and say, hey, are you okay with this? You seem to be, but we just want to double check, right? Maybe we do that. That would be an acceptable way to handle this. Maybe we go to Luke and say, hey, Luke, we know you're from Alabama. We know you love the South, but we want to be sensitive to everybody in the workplace. Would you kindly put a different muscle car over the General Lee? That would be an acceptable course of action too. Maybe we say that just doesn't line up with our culture. We're not going to allow the General Lee to be displayed, even though it may not be overt racism. We could go either way. One of the things we also have to keep in mind is even though Bo and Luke seem okay with the General Lee being displayed, and even if you might pull Bo aside and say, hey, Bo, we want to be sensitive. Are you okay with Luke's display of the General Lee? And Bo says, yes, we do know other employees walk past. And while Bo might be okay with it, maybe Ann is not. Maybe Ann walks past that every day and says, I cannot believe that this employer allows this to be displayed. And I'm not going to keep working for an employer who supports this type of display culturally or whatever in the workplace. And so I'm going to leave. Maybe I'm going to sue too because I view that as racist or whatever. Whatever my issues are, you may lose other employees and you have an affirmative obligation to them. Just because Bo and Luke are okay with something, you may have lots of other employees who walk by who are not okay with it and who are shy. They don't have to tell you that they have a problem with it before they sue because you are on notice already that that sticker or whatever is out there. What if we have Luke, okay? So we have a close call, as are many HR issues, on the little General Lee sticker. In this day and age, I probably would do something to address that. That's probably not the culture that we want in our workplace, given the sensitivities, but it's a close call. If they were customer facing, that would push me even more towards trying to do something about that sticker. All right. What if Luke acquires a Dodge Charger, paints it orange to resemble the General Lee, and sticks the Confederate flag on the top of it? Maybe even has, some of those poles, and he's got some on his windows too, or whatever. And he parks it in our parking lot every day. What do we think about that? Some of you may be saying, hey, good for Luke. He's very creative. Again, this is up to us, right? And it may depend on our employee parking lot, whether customers see that or not. It may depend on our company culture, whether we care about that or not. But we have the right as an employer to make a decision on that. It's not freedom of expression. I don't care if it's his car. It's our parking lot. If he wants to do that, we could say, hey, you need to park on the street or something. We don't support that type of messaging, even though you view it as just good old Southern lifestyle. Other people may view it other ways, and we just don't want that conflict. And so guess what? You get to park on the street or bring a different car to work. We are free to say that as an employer. He has no rights to be parking in our parking lot. Again, this is assuming a non-union workplace. So we can make a call. Maybe we say, we just don't care. Now, the reality of the situation is most employees don't show up in the General Lee, but a lot of them show up with interesting bumper stickers. And that issue landed on my desk more than I care to think about. I can't believe the number of creative bumper stickers that are out there on different topics. And you'd have a truck or a car with something that probably was offensive to a large group of people. And the question is, do we do something about it? Yeah, we can if we want to. Remember, we need to be consistent. So if we're going to take the viewpoint that the General Lee is offensive or the Confederate flag is offensive, and we don't want that in our parking lot, or we don't want it in our workplace, we're going to be consistent across the board in how we handle potentially offensive decals or imagery or whatever in our workplace. But we can handle that as we see fit for our culture. And hopefully we have a policy that backs us up. If we don't, and we'll talk about policies a little bit in the next slide, or we have a policy and we've never enforced it, which is very common. Oftentimes employers have policies that they don't enforce until they run into sort of the sticky situation. Now they want to enforce the policy. We can do that. Just because we haven't enforced a policy before, we can start enforcing it today, February, whatever today's date is, 9th, and go forward with that. We've had a change of heart. We now want to enforce it. It's our right as an employer. What if Luke experiences a marital breakup and replaces his wife's pictures with Daisy's bikini pinup? Those of you from the 70s know who Daisy is. She quit working at the local tavern and has taken to modeling. Yes, I watched way too much of the Dukes of Hazzard as a kid. This is a problem. So pinups or girly calendars, or the opposite of that, the firefighters in New York and calendar and all that good stuff that's got the guys who must spend their entire life at the gym or something. That is definitely a problem in my view. If we've got that displayed in the workplace, we need to take that down. The courts are pretty clear that any type of pinup or calendar or girly decal or hunk decal, I don't know what you call them, I'm too old to know these terms anymore, needs to come down, because those are viewed as offensive, and the less clothes on the person, the more offensive it is. So if Luke takes to hanging up Daisy Duke's picture that she made Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition with, we need to curb that behavior unless we're really interested in some type of sexual discrimination, sexual harassment lawsuit. I'm assuming we're not, so we need to curb that. That is pretty clear in the courts that we shouldn't have that. All right, moving on. Let's go past the Dukes of Hazzard in my childhood. This is from a case that was just decided a week or two ago. So I'll tell you who the company is afterwards. This was in Massachusetts. So in 2020, this company implemented a mask requirement policy in response to COVID. Sounds familiar, right? Most companies had that. That's fine. This company was an essential employer providing needed services. There was no question it was an essential employer. At first, its employees were lucky just to get masks, right? We all remember 2.5 years ago, whatever it's been, it seems like a long time, masks were in short supply. So if you had a paper mask, you held on to it for dear life. The majority of the employees initially wore just these simple paper masks. So far, so good, right? Then the mask market boomed. We all saw that, right? Folks started showing up in bejeweled masks. There were designer masks, masks with smiley faces, dog faces, rainbows, whatever. You name it, you could get masks with rhinestones, whatever you wanted. The company even made its own logo masks. So it had the color of the company and its sort of logo on the side of the mask and handed them out to employees. That seems like a good idea. And then they started seeing masks with slogans. And those ranged everything from "Have a nice day" to "Black Lives Matter." And I just want to reiterate something here. I stay apolitical in all these discussions, so I'm not saying Black Lives Matter is great or bad or anything in between. This is just what happened. So the company is a large company. It probably is viewed by most people as being a more liberal or progressive company on most issues. Maybe not everybody would agree with it, but I think that's probably most people's view of this company. And almost all of its employees are customer facing. So if I have the mask on that says, I support animal rights, or I support Black Lives Matter, or I support whatever, customers are going to see it. The company did have a long-standing anti-slogan policy. So in other words, in its handbook, it had for over a decade a policy that said you cannot wear any writing, essentially, except for the company logo. It had never really enforced this policy. So people wore buttons and other things prior to the mask policy that had, rainbows, I support gay rights, whatever it might be, on their uniform. The main reason, historically, why companies had an anti-slogan policy was to prevent unionization. So historically, companies didn't want employees wearing, I support the SEIU, or I support the PSEA, or I support Iron Workers of America, whatever union you want to pick. My husband's in a union, so I'm in no way union bashing. Well, if we have time, I'll tell a funny story about the union later. In any event, the company hasn't enforced it. Now they're getting concerned because the masks are so political. They decide to start enforcing their mask policy, their anti-slogan policy with respect to their masks, and with respect to the buttons and whatever else is going on. An employee sued saying, hey, I want to wear Black Lives Matter on my mask. What did the court say? The court actually agreed with the employer and said, hey, you're the employer. Granted, you didn't enforce your policy for a decade or so, but given the changing climate, changing political climate, just changed how society has changed, you've now decided you want to enforce your policy. And most importantly, the employer did it across the board. So if I had on, I support animal rights, whatever, I couldn't wear that. If I had on there, have a nice day, whatever, that mask was gone. All masks that had slogans, except the company slogan, were eliminated. And the court said, hey, that's fine. Nobody has a right to put a slogan on something. An employer, you don't have to allow them to do it as long as you're consistent. And this employer was consistent. Do we want to know who the employer was? Drum roll, please. It was Whole Foods. So Whole Foods ended up in court in Massachusetts over this, and they prevailed because although they had not enforced their policy in a long time, they were consistent when they started enforcing it. From a practical standpoint, if you're an employer sitting out there and saying, yeah, I have this policy or whatever policy on the books, so to speak, And we've never enforced it. And I really think the time is right that we should start enforcing this policy or whatever policy it is. My recommendation to you would be forewarned is fair warned. So if you're about to start enforcing something that you've never enforced before or enforced it inconsistently, it's fair to tell your employees that, hey, given the changing climate, given the changing whatever, or just company culture, whatever you want to cite to, we are now going to start enforcing this effective Monday. Gives them a chance to prepare and not get disciplined for something that up until this point has been a-okay to do. Okay, moving on. We have some puzzled coworkers. So this is a really typical, this was an office environment. Excuse me, I'm actually not sick. I was just drinking a drink prior to this and choked on it. And so I'm old and now I'm coughing. We have a situation where the workers clock out for lunch. Typical scenario, right? They eat lunch in an employer provided lunchroom or break room. Typical scenario. There's different groups, right? People gravitate to each other. They have their own little clique or friends or whatever, and they tend to do activities together at lunch. Some go out for a walk. Some do crosswords, some read, some do puzzles. Is there any issue with that? No, of course not. There's not. Except now we have table A who does the Noah's Ark puzzle. Some people may perceive Noah's Ark to be religious symbolism, and other people view it as it's just a cute little kids thing. We do nurseries in Noah's Ark, and who cares? Table B objected to the religious symbolism in the workplace. What do we do? Table B is telling HR, make table A stop their puzzle and throw it out. So HR is not going to get a lunch out of this mess, right? That's the only thing that's always true, is HR is always the one putting out the fire. Table A, hey, I'm sorry about table B, but we do have freedoms in this country, right? We may not have the freedom of speech or freedom of expression. We could tell table A, go toss your puzzle. That is an option, but we don't have to. And in fact, we might get in trouble doing that, because if up to this point, we've allowed all other types of puzzles, right? Flowers, cottages, whatever. And all of a sudden we want to toss one that has some perhaps religious symbolism to it, we may have a religious discrimination issue on our hands. This is different than the freedom of speech, where we say, hey, you don't have freedom of speech here, right? We could stop table A from chanting Bible verses or something at the break room. But to have a puzzle is pretty low-key and innocuous. To prevent it, I think, is a high risk of a religious discrimination suit. So I think if in this situation, we would either take the position, okay, nobody does any activities in the lunchroom anymore, which is probably not realistic, or, you know what, we're going to tolerate it. But if we tolerate it, and table B, we're not forcing you to do the puzzle, right? You can do whatever you want. We have to know that if table B brings in an equally troubling puzzle from perhaps table A's perspective, then we're going to have to permit that too. So at some point, the puzzles may become too graphic or too crude or too whatever, and we may draw a line. But if we say to table A, throw out the puzzle, we probably have a religious discrimination issue going, because we allow other things. We've never had rules about this before. If table B brings in a demonic puzzle, assuming it's not overly graphic or something like that, that we would say, we object to how graphic it is, not the content, then we're probably going to have to let table B do that puzzle as well. Or maybe table B belongs to a different faith and they want to bring in a puzzle about their faith. We're probably going to have to let that fly. If we want to get rid of all of it, we can get rid of all of it. That is our cultural call, but I wouldn't just pick on the Noah's Ark puzzle. Now, if the puzzle group brought in a really graphic Christian puzzle, and I'm not sure what that would be, but let's just say it's out there, we could say, hey, no to that graphicness. It's not the religious aspect of it, is how graphic it is. We don't want blood and gore in our workplace. Same thing with table B. And remember, please feel free to ask questions as we go on. If you have puzzle issues in your workplace, we can talk about them. So HR has skipped lunch to figure out this mess. I would recommend taking a light hand with this because I think table B is in the wrong with respect to their complaint. And table A, if we let other puzzles go, we're gonna have a tough time objecting to one that has a religious overtone. Okay, moving along. Whoops. See, this is why I'm not good with technology. Hit too many buttons with my little fingers. All right, what about clubs? And I'm going to tell you where this is taken from after we talk about it. So we have a large employer, hundreds of people. They have multiple conference rooms in a multi-floor downtown building. Different employee groups use unoccupied conference rooms for meetings. We have the women's executive lunch group. It meets twice a month. We have the new employees meet and greet group. None of these are required. They are just groups that employees started on their own to make connections, right? There's a lot of talk about mentoring and sponsorship and stuff like that. These employees took some initiative. And then we have some employees who, instead of like meeting in the lunchroom, they're just looking for a smaller place because we have a knitting group that does charitable blankets for babies in hospitals. Gee, that seems nice and good, right? We don't want to kill charity in our workplace, I hope. We have an art club. They also are into theater and stuff like that. They actually display works of art in our lunchroom. And so far, they haven't displayed anything that's caused a problem. Remember the Detroit case, okay? We don't want them displaying something inappropriate, but they like to do watercolors and stuff like that. And that seems like a nice hobby. And if they want to get together and do some lunch in the conference room or do some art, or talk about art in the conference room, that's great. No issues with any of those. As an employer, we don't have to allow any of them, but as an employer, I'm not sure why we would object to any of that either. Except here's what comes down the pike. So the rule is these aren't employer sponsored. They aren't paid time. The employer is not requiring anybody to go to any of this. They're not providing food for it. They're just saying, hey, if the conference room is free, knock yourself out and use it. But as a practical matter, there's almost always conference rooms available because they have like 24 conference rooms. An employee comes and says, hey, I'd like to use the conference room one time a week for a prayer group. Now we've got religion in the workplace. What do we do? And this is where I wish we had a seminar so I could see a show of hands or we could talk about this, but we've got a webinar. In any event, what do we do? Well, the answer is pretty simple. We're going to be consistent. And if they want to do a prayer group and we have an unoccupied conference room and the people are off the clock and it's all voluntary, nobody's, holding a gun to anybody's head to come to the prayer group, we're going to let them do it. We've let the knitting group do it. We've let the art club do it. We've let the new employee group do it, whatever. If we actually said no to the prayer group, we might have a religious discrimination issue on our hands, just like the puzzle thing. If we allow certain groups, it's tough to say no to other groups. Now, that was a Christian prayer group. If we had had a Muslim prayer group, the answer would be, okay, you do it too under the same conditions. We could either say no to almost everybody, or we could say yes to almost everything. Now, at some point, we may want to draw the line, right? There's certain groups that we may say, hey, that doesn't fit into our culture. We're not going to support a group that's racist, for instance, because that would be violating the law. Whereas the law says we have to make a religious accommodation, the law also says you can't have racism in the workplace. So if the KKK said, hey, we'd like to use a conference room, first of all, we need to start counseling that employee if that's what the employee wants to do. But secondly, we can say no because we are not supporting a racist group that's against the law, etc. So having a prayer group is acceptable in our workplace, and we might even have to do it if we've allowed the knitting and the art club and the blanket club and whatever else to be there. And really, it's not such a bad thing. This can build employee camaraderie. The women's executive lunch. We're looking at mentors and sponsorship. We're looking at connections in the other groups, whether it's the new employees or the knitting or the art club or whatever it is. The employee takes it one step further and says they want to use the company email to send out a message about the new group so everybody knows. They just want to send out one message. What do we say to that? Well, here's where I would draw a line, okay? And here's where I would implement some walls or borders on how we allow these sorts of things to go through. The best thing that you can do is have, you may have like an all office email. Get like a for sale email where employees can voluntarily sign up for the for sale email or whatever you want to call that email chain. And the knitting club can post on there and say, hey, we've got a knitting club meeting. Come if you want. The prayer group can post on there. Hey, we're new. We've got a prayer group meeting. Come if you want, right? We're not going to have any emails that are harassing or forceful or anything else, because that would go against our communications policy that we should have. But we're going to force all of this extraneous communication that's not work related into this for sale email chain, or whatever we want to call it, email chain. This example, I've changed some details on this, came from the really large law firm that I used to work for. We did allow the prayer group. We did allow the art. I was part of the women's attorneys group. It is permissible. We never had any issues with it. And we did have a for sale email chain so that nobody was blasting the whole office with a, hey, come to the knitting group party. If I wanted to sign up for the for sale email chain and it was completely voluntary, whether I did it or not, then I would get messages about the knitting club or the art club or the women's lunch or whatever was going on that really wasn't work related. And this has additional benefits too that we'll talk about in a minute here of setting up a separate email chain like that. All right, here's what we're going to talk about. Excuse me 1 second while I get a drink. Okay. You got the person who sells anything, everything at work, whether it's Tupperware or Girl Scout cookies or hoagies or whatever. It's Daisy from the Dukes of Hazzard. She quit her bar job. She quit her modeling job when she had kids, and they're all raising money for something. What's the harm in letting her put up the little Girl Scout cookie form on the refrigerator? I realize a lot of these are electronic now. What's the harm in letting her send out the Girl Scout link to sign up for her kids' cookies? Most people want Thin Mints, right? So again, here we have a situation. Some people feel pressured, especially if Daisy is the boss. Daisy's kid is selling cookies again. I'm going to have to buy them. Steer this type of communication into your for sale email list. The problem you have, and what is a concern from a labor law standpoint, in addition to just the what I'll call not a legal concern, but just a concern that people feel pressured to buy from Daisy, is if you ever had unionizing activity in your workplace. If you let Daisy send out an email blast to the entire company on her girls' dance troupe candies or whatever that she's selling, then you're going to have to allow union communications that way too, union organizing campaign. Same thing if you let her post it in the employee break room, then guess what? You're going to be posting union stuff in there too. You want to channel these types of communications in a way that you're forcing them into like the for sale email chain, or you're forcing them onto only one bulletin board or something like that, so that they're not all over the office, and you're lowering your risk of where they're seen or where there's a problem, and also lowering your risk of what you would have to do if there's a union organizing campaign. Okay, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because apparently I've talked way too much about the Dukes. So here's another situation that was handled by yours truly, probably about 8 years ago. Two best friends at work. They're not peers. One's a supervisor and one is his subordinate, but they're both really high level executives. They've worked together for 25 years. They go to lunch almost every day. The supervisor is Italian and proud of it. His subordinate is not. That's fine. The supervisor apparently thinks he's Don Corleone because every day when he invites a subordinate to lunch, he says, I'm going to make you an offer that you can't refuse, in his best Godfather voice. Nobody has objected. How did this land on my desk? Well, guess what? They fired somebody who said, hey, I was discriminated against based on my ethnicity. I'm not Italian. Clearly, this guy favors Italians because he makes this comment every day. Frankly, this is a really low-level risk. The lawsuit didn't go anywhere. It was a pain for the employer to deal with it. But this does bring out a certain issue in terms of sensitivity of what you say and do, especially if you're the second in command at the company, which this guy was. And so everybody who walked past had heard this line, had heard him talk about things. You need to be sensitive. The higher up you get, the more sensitive you need to be about what you're doing. All in the Family. I had this case or some variation of it probably 3 or 4 times a year. So you get an employee who's been there for forever. He's a great employee or she's a great employee. They have a kid who needs a job. You assume the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and you hire the kid. The parent is grateful. And it turns out that the apple can not only fall from the tree, it can roll down the hill and into the neighbor's yard and be permanently bruised and just a disaster. The son's about to be fired. What do? So a couple things. First, you're not going to keep the son, even if you really, really like the father. You may risk losing the father. That was a risk you took when you hired the son. If you weren't comfortable with that risk, you shouldn't have hired the son in the first place. You may have an anti-nepotism policy, or you may not. Depends where you are, how big the labor pool is for where you're at. That's something you can always consider going forward. I would, though, as sort of a way to soften the blow to the father, talk to the father and say, hey, we have either just fired the son or about to, we value you, we want to keep you, we're sorry this happened, blah, 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 whatever you want to say. I would say in 80% of the cases that reached my desk, because employers are really worried about firing their best employee's son, the father actually understood and said, I know my kid's got issues, or the mother, whoever. So, but I think that sort of personal touch helps soften the blow here so that you don't lose dad or mom. And oftentimes the parents do recognize the concerns with respect to their own kids. All right, let's go to Valentine's Day. So we have a high-ranking male executive. He's a terrific rainmaker. He brings in millions. It's great, right? He has a secretary. No, she's not the one involved with him romantically. She has been his secretary for about 2 decades, and they're on friendly terms. They're good friends, no problem. He has a wife. He shares another executive accounts assistant with others in his department. These are all high-ranking executives who share this account executive. She is the one involved. She's relatively new to the company. She's only been there about 6 months when this affair starts. Without his wife's knowledge, but with the secretary's full knowledge, he starts an affair with the accounts assistant. He affirmatively instructs his secretary to lie to his wife and cover for him. He also has her hide certain bills from the wife, certain trips, whatever. Other executives in his department stop giving the account assistant work. She does not have enough work to keep her busy. Does the company care? This is all consensual, right? So yeah, you should care a lot on this example. We have multiple harassment and discrimination issues lurking in the background. First, even though the secretary is not the lady involved, we're putting her in a horrible position. And she has an argument for harassment or sex discrimination that she's forced to do bad things because of this extramarital relationship that's going on. So our secretary actually has a cause of action against the company because of the position that we're putting her in. Number 2, if the relationship goes south with the accounts assistant, she's got a cause of action with respect to us. Number 3, we have an issue that she is not really a great employee. Everybody else has stopped giving her work. The reason they stopped giving her work was she wasn't good. And they were afraid of getting on this guy's bad side if they said anything negative about the accounts executive and her work product or quality of work. So they just didn't give her work. That's a huge issue because we had other account assistants out there who had to take up her slack. And she was the lady involved in being unfairly rated highly because the only person rating her was one of her supervisors. That, so other people got this rating from everybody, and she's getting this like stellar rating whenever she doesn't really deserve it. And she's getting the accompanying raise and bonus and whatever because the only person rating her is the guy she's having an affair with. What do we do? So first and foremost, I don't think you can stop dating in the workplace. Some companies have an anti-dating policy. You're welcome to try. I think people go underground and you get the issue. Peer-to-peer dating presents a lot less risk and issues than supervisor to subordinate dating, which is what this was. Typically, we would recommend moving one of them so that they're not in a reporting relationship anymore. The company did do that. This is not the outcome that I would have wanted from an ethical standpoint, but what the company did essentially is said, hey, this guy is such a rainmaker, we're going to offer severance agreements to the secretary and the assistant to get them out of the workplace so that we don't have the issue. And we're going to let this guy continue to be our great rainmaker and go for it. There's perhaps an ethics issue with that, but it did solve the problem. I'm not recommending that as a great solution. But you should know the liability is there from multiple sources. The secretary, the assistant, the other assistants who are getting sort of the raw end of the deal because this lady hardly has to work and is getting great reviews. So we definitely should care. We probably should have done something other than the severance agreements, but that is an option. And we probably should have separated the two, and we should never have put the secretary in the position of lying to the wife, because that's a pretty big problem there. Okay, what about this? This company took the opposite stance, right? We've got company A in the last scenario that tolerated this because the guy was such a big rainmaker and went in a direction that some people might find troubling. But it did solve their problem. In this situation, we don't have a written policy on dating. We have one of two vice presidents who's going through a divorce who decides to become romantically involved with his secretary. The company president fires the VP but retains the secretary. Do we have a problem? So the VP turned around and sued the company for reverse discrimination because he was male and the secretary that we retained was female. But no, we don't have a problem. We won the lawsuit, and here's why. We can hold a superior in our company, especially one who's like number 2 or 3 in the company, to a much higher standard than we can the secretary, right? We should expect out of our highest ranking employees the best behavior. And even though we didn't have a policy about dating in the workplace or whatever, we can say, hey, this sets just a rotten example. She is your direct report. We don't support this in the workplace, and we're going to keep the secretary because she is, we don't expect as much out of our rank and file employees essentially as we do out of a VP. So the employer wins the lawsuit basically. What if we kept the VP? We could. That sort of takes us to our next slide. If we have a supervisor to subordinate relationship, I strongly recommend, again, the peer-to-peer stuff, I don't feel strongly about. You got to watch it a little bit because you can get a harassment complaint, but a supervisor to subordinate, typically we're going to transfer one of the parties. Usually we transfer the higher ranking person if there was an opening. If there wasn't an opening, we might have a resignation or termination situation on our hands. And that's what it is. Hopefully we have a handbook policy to reflect that we're going to do that. We may make them enter into what we call an I love you contract. I really don't like those except in really high ranking situations. If we have peer-to-peer relationships, we can certainly do an I love you contract where we say, hey, all this is consensual. You're going to tell us if it's not consensual. We have a harassment policy. We'll enforce it. We'll look at it if there's any problems down the road. I think a lot of rank and file folks would object to signing one of those and view it as intrusive and whatever. But if we have our second in charge having a relationship like this, then I think an I love you contract might be appropriate, as well as a job transfer or some sort of separation between the two of them. He's not going to review her, whatever it might be. We're going to put up some sort of wall so that we don't get issues about favoritism and one employee being treated better than the other because she is providing favors or whatever we want to say, or has a relationship with the second in command. And remember, we can definitely expect more and better out of our supervisors, out of our management, than we might expect out of our rank and file. It is perfectly fine to have a policy that says we don't care about peer-to-peer dating, but you ain't going to do it if you are a supervisor subordinate relationship. And if you do it, you're going to tell us about it, and we're going to take certain steps to ensure that that relationship does not cause problems in the workplace. All right, with that, we are done for Valentine's Day. Hopefully I'm getting you out of here on time. If anybody has any questions, I'll stick around for a second. Otherwise, thanks for attending. And I hope you all have happy relationships in your workplace and a good Valentine's Day. Take care. And remember the seminar next month. I hope to see all of you there.